The first time the forest said her name, she thought it was her mother's voice, calling her in for dinner the way she had 20 years ago. Her mother had been dead for 6 of those years. The forest knew that. The forest knew a great many things it had no right to know. Chapter 5. The Empty Chapter. She had come to the forest for silence, which was, she would later understand, the single greatest mistake of her life. The trailhead sat at the edge of a valley, the map called Ash Grove Hollow, though the locals in the last town before the tree line had simply called it the Old Wood, and had said it in a tone that made her wonder, briefly, whether she should turn back before she'd even started. She hadn't. Silence was what she'd come for, and the Old Wood promised more of it than anywhere else within a day's drive. No roads, no towers, no other hikers foolish enough to walk in this late in the season. The trees closed over the path within the first 10 minutes, and the ordinary sounds of the world, birds, wind, her own footsteps on gravel, thinned into something denser and older, a quiet that felt less like absence and more like attention. She walked for nearly an hour before she heard it the first time. Her name, soft, familiar, carried on no wind she could feel, spoken in a voice that landed somewhere in her chest before it landed in her ears. Her mother's voice, warm and unmistakable, calling her the way she used to from the back porch when the streetlights came on. She stopped walking, turned in a slow circle. Trees in every direction, uncountable, identical. The path behind her already swallowed into a corridor of trunks that looked no different from any other. She told herself it was a bird. Some forests had birds that mimicked sound with uncanny precision. She'd read that somewhere, or thought she had. And the human mind was a pattern-hungry thing, always eager to turn noise into meaning, meaning into a mother's voice. She kept walking. The voice did not call again for a long while, and by the time an hour had passed, she'd folded the moment into the back of her mind, filed under exhaustion and imagination, and mostly forgotten it. Mostly. The second time, it used her middle name, the one almost nobody used, the one only her mother had ever called her in moments of real tenderness, the one she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 6 years. It came from somewhere off to her left, deep in a stand of birches, so pale they looked bleached by moonlight, despite the overcast sky. And this time, she didn't stop walking. She walked faster. She told herself, with the particular firmness of someone lying to themselves on purpose, that she must have said it herself at some point, muttered it under her breath, the way tired hikers talk to themselves for company. She did not believe this. She needed to believe it anyway. An hour later, or what she judged to be an hour, though she'd stopped trusting her own sense of time by then, she checked her watch and found its hands frozen at 2:15. The exact time, she realized, with a slow crawl of dread up the back of her neck, that her mother had died. She had never told anyone that time. She had barely let herself remember it. The path narrowed. She noticed, with the detached clarity of someone cataloging evidence for a court she hoped never to face, that the trees around her had begun to look wrong in ways too small to name outright. A birch standing where she was fairly certain an oak had stood minutes before, a fallen log now lying perpendicular to the path instead of parallel, the particular arrangement of roots at her feet subtly rearranged, like furniture moved half an inch while she wasn't looking. She told herself forests were disorienting. She told herself this was simply what it felt like to be lost. She was, by then, unmistakably lost. The voice returned as afternoon light gave way to something grayer, flatter, a light with no clear source and no clear direction, the kind of light that made it impossible to judge how much of the day remained. It called her name again. And this time, it was not her mother's voice at all. It was her own, speaking from somewhere ahead of her on the path, low and urgent, saying words she'd only ever said once, silently, to herself, on the worst night of her life. Words she had never spoken aloud to another living soul. The forest had reached into a place she had never let anyone see, and it wore what it found there like a second skin. She stopped walking entirely, stood very still among the trees, breath shallow, and made herself consider, for the first time with real seriousness, that she was not simply lost, that something about this place operated on rules she did not understand and had no way to test. She turned to retrace her steps. The path behind her was gone, not overgrown, not obscured by fallen branches or drifting fog, simply gone, replaced by the same undifferentiated stretch of trunks and roots and shadow that surrounded her on every other side, as though the forest had quietly closed the door behind her the moment she'd stopped watching it. Panic, when it finally arrived, was almost a relief, a clean, understandable emotion after an hour of creeping, formless dread. She ran. She did not know in which direction, only that motion felt safer than stillness, and she crashed through low branches and uneven ground until her lungs burned and her legs shook, until she stumbled into a small clearing she was certain. With the desperate hope of the utterly lost she had never seen before. She had seen it before. She recognized the particular fallen log at its center, the pale stones scattered near its northern edge. She had passed through this exact clearing perhaps 40 minutes earlier, walking in what she'd believed was a straight line away from it. The forest had led her in a circle, or the forest had moved around her while she ran. She no longer had any confidence in which explanation frightened her less. She sat on the fallen log because her legs would no longer carry her, and in the stillness that followed, the whispering did not stop. It multiplied. Voices layered over voices, dozens of them now, all speaking her name in overlapping fragments, some familiar, some entirely unknown to her. And beneath the tangle of sound, she began to make out actual sentences, actual memories, recited back to her with perfect, violating accuracy. The exact words her father had said the day he left. The name of the childhood pet she'd never told a single living soul she still grieved. The precise, humiliating shape of a fear she had never once spoken, because speaking it would have made it real. The forest was not calling to her. It was reading her. Slowly, methodically, the way a person reads a book they intend to finish before nightfall. She pressed her hands over her ears, which did nothing, because the voices were not arriving through sound at all. They were arriving from somewhere behind her eyes, inside the architecture of her own skull, and covering her ears only made the silence of her own blocked hearing more obviously, horribly hollow. Night fell without any perceptible transition, the gray light simply deepening into black between one blink and the next, and in the total dark, the whispering finally, mercifully, quieted, replaced by something worse. A presence. Not seen, not heard, but felt with total skin-crawling certainty, standing just beyond the reach of a vision that could no longer see anything at all. Something enormous and ancient and endlessly patient, arranged around her in every direction at once, the way water surrounds a swimmer who has only just realized how far from shore they've drifted. She did not sleep. She was not certain, looking back, that she had ever been fully awake. Dawn arrived the way the dark had abruptly, without gradient, and in the sudden gray light, she found herself standing, though she had no memory of rising, at the edge of the tree line, the valley trailhead visible not 20 feet ahead of her, exactly where she had started the day before. She walked out of the forest on legs that did not feel entirely her own, climbed into her car, and drove 3 hours before she allowed herself to stop shaking, long enough to think clearly. It was in a roadside diner, hands wrapped around a coffee. She couldn't taste that the final and worst understanding arrived. She had gone into the forest to escape a silence she couldn't bear at home. The silence of an empty house, 6 years after her mother's death, 6 years of talking to rooms that never answered. She had told herself she wanted quiet. What she had actually wanted, she now understood with a clarity that turned her stomach, was to be heard, to be known, to have someone, anything, prove they had been paying attention to her all along. The forest had heard her. The forest had been listening for longer than she wanted to imagine. And reaching for her phone to call someone, anyone who might tell her she was safe now. Home, now done with it. She caught her own reflection in the diner's dark window and found herself unable to say with any real certainty whether the version of her sitting in that booth had walked out of the forest at dawn, or whether the forest, having finished reading everything worth knowing about her, had simply sent something wearing her face back out in her place, leaving the real her still standing somewhere among the trees listening, for the first time, to a voice calling a name that was no longer hers to answer. She has not been back to that valley since, but some nights in the hush just before sleep, she hears her own voice whisper her name from somewhere very close to her ear. And she has stopped being able to tell whether it is memory or invitation, or something the forest left behind inside her the day she walked back out through the trees.